This game aims for the precise opposite, to convey the very real tragedy of bereavement without romanticizing it. And that tragedy lies in that very feeling that the game did not adequately explore Joel and Ellie's relationship. It lies in the ruins of an enormous palace of longing and hopes and expectations. Anybody who has ever lost anybody will tell you this. The single greatest roadblock to overcoming grief is the innate human desire for closure. This desire for closure can be traced back to primal roots. Thus, the wish to see everything wrapped up in a nice little bow, including bereavement. And this is what separates real grief from fiction. Those all-consuming feelings of despair, denial, those real demons that real people grapple with for decades in real life, those emotions that leave them in an eternal state of trauma and incline them towards the suicidal. Those emotions arise in this very gap. They are formed because people dread coping alone with the weight of everything left unsaid. When all the loose threads have been tied together, and more importantly, when you are not expecting any more time with the deceased, there is no sense of deprivation. There is no sense of being robbed of anything, of having something taken away unfairly. This is why people who die of old age may leave grief in their wake, but never genuine misery. Therein lies the difference between the guttural screams of agony evoked by real loss, and the bittersweet man tears we cry in mindless blockbusters.
But then he realises the damage is just too great. Joel gives up, flops his hand to the sand, and stares off at the sunset. And just as his eyes begin to drift away, a horse charges down the beach with Ellie on top. Ellie runs towards him and immediately tries to stop the bleeding, begging for him to hold on. She says it was Dina who did it, and she begs for his forgiveness. Joel forgives her instantly, and he makes her promise to be strong, to look after the people at Jackson, because he can't anymore. He tells her to remember all of the lessons that he taught her, and she promises to. "That's my girl," he says weakly, and as his eyelids shut, Ellie, tears welling in her eyes, cries out, "Dad!"
That's why superheroes get superhero endings, which are melodramatic and satisfying, and are perfectly suitable to appease the audience for commercial movies because they omit all the horror of real bereavement and instead choose to babysit the viewer by making it a climactic, conclusive ending where the hero takes as long to die as is necessary to go out on a satisfying one-liner. Not just commercial movies, but even stories that, on the surface, seem dedicated to exploring a real relationship in its true sense, always end up averting real tragedy in some way or the other, compromising the emotional integrity of the experience to make it more palatable for the viewer. This game aims for the precise opposite, to convey the very real tragedy of bereavement without romanticizing it. And that tragedy lies in that very feeling that the game did not adequately explore Joel and Ellie's relationship. It lies in the ruins of an enormous palace of longing and hopes and expectations. Anybody who has ever lost anybody will tell you this. Stories simply aren't willing to go there because that is where stories become mature, and thus that is where the common audience finds themselves out of their depth. In real life, people have God to blame, but you can't send death threats to God. You can't say my life isn't canon. It's not that people don't feel like saying these things, it's just that it never works. So naturally, when a game tries to convey these feelings by taking away someone so dear to the player so unfairly, throwing away the controller or cutting up the disc becomes the equivalent of suicide. Sending death threats to Neil Druckmann becomes the equivalent of denouncing God. And saying that The Last of Us Part 2 isn't canon, or saying that Joel would never find himself in such a situation, becomes the equivalent of denying the reality of your situation. These are all mechanisms that real people often resort to after experiencing loss. So the very fact that Joel's death has sparked such tremendous outrage is testament to how effectively The Last of Us Part 2 conveyed the intended emotions. There are people who believe that the actions on Joel's part leading up to his death were inconsistent with his character. This belief has been refuted countless times, but there seems to be a misunderstanding as to what those refutations actually are. The point isn't that Joel forgot his survival instincts because he's been living in relative peace and security for 4 years. It is that Joel has been living in a community actively dedicated to rekindling the humanity within its population. Jackson encouraged its citizens to make a conscious effort to be more accepting of and kind towards strangers. For the past 4 years, Joel's outlook on strangers has been changed from imminent threat to potential members of the Jackson community. It's not that he has forgotten his survival instincts, it's just that his approach to strangers has shifted from one requiring survival instincts to one requiring kindness and diplomacy. Add this to the fact that it was Tommy, always the relatively naive younger brother, who actually revealed their names to Abby, and that there was a blizzard outside which would prevent their horses from reaching Jackson, not to mention a massive zombie horde that forced them towards Abby's lodge in the first place, and I don't see why there should be any contention on this topic at all. But the reason for which everyone feels this way, once again, has more to do with coping mechanisms to avoid coming to terms with Joel's death by disputing the validity of his death, instead of a disagreement with the way his character was written. Now, I completely understand hating the game for these reasons as a consumer. As consumers, we were promised a story with Joel and Ellie back together, and that's not what we got. As consumers, it is easy to feel cheated, deceived, and betrayed by this game. And this is precisely why art should never be judged as a consumer. With the rise of consumer centrism, stories will inevitably become less and less nuanced and challenging. And the present scenario, where Marvel essentially runs the film industry, is the perfect illustration of my point. This is why fan service-heavy atrocities like Avengers Endgame and The Rise of Skywalker get made. The last complaint people had with Joel's death was that he was disrespected by the game. And that, my friends, will be the subject of an upcoming video.